Everybody, thank you so much for joining me on another stream. My name is Eric Manning. You're watching Testify, and this is the channel where we talk about historical apologetics, the resurrection of Jesus, the reliability of the Gospels, the argument for miracles, and all of that fun stuff. And today, I'm going to talk to you guys about what you can probably see on the screen there, and judging by the thumbnail on the video that you clicked on, C.S. Lewis was probably smarter than you. And so we're going to be talking about some of the thoughts that shaped C.S. Lewis as a young atheist, because he was an atheist, and some of the reasoning behind why he was an atheist, and then some of his journey in becoming a Christian, especially in related to the Gospels, like how his mind shifted from viewing the Gospels as one way to a completely different way. And so just jumping right in, a text that I picked for this particular talk that I'm doing here is 2 Peter 1:16, for we do not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses to his majesty. And so I'm sure you will see as we go along why I picked this particular text. And so C.S. Lewis, as I mentioned earlier, was an atheist into his teens and even into his 20s. I forget exactly like what age he was when he converted, but he rejected Christianity at first, and he explains one of the big reasons why. This is a letter that he was writing to one of his friends, which is shared in his book, Surprised by Joy. And it says, "You're asking me about my religious views. You know, I believe in no religion. There's absolutely no proof for any of them. And from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best. All religions, or mythologies, as they should rightly be called, are merely human inventions." And so sounds very much like, an atheist that you would talk to like online or in person today, right? Going even further, he explains why he rejected Christianity. He says, "Often great men are regarded as gods after their death, such as Hercules or Odin. So after the death of the Hebrew philosopher named Yeshua, whose name we've now corrupted into Jesus, he was seen as a god, leading to the rise of a cult connected with the ancient Hebrew Yahweh worship, thus giving birth to Christianity, one mythology among many, but the one that we happen to be brought up with." And so Lewis is like, okay, why is Jesus special? Why does Jesus get a free pass? Okay. There's all of these other mythologies. There's all of these other stories. But yours is the correct one. I don't understand this, right? And you hear a lot of this echoed today, right? In my conversation with Derek Lambert on the stream that he did on my channel a while ago, and just my conversations with him on his channel, his argument is basically, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck, right? And so that was basically the same argument that Lewis had too. He saw the similarities and just thought, okay, why does Jesus get this special pass from scrutiny? Why not all these other myths? You guys have a double standard. This is special pleading. Okay. Now, later on, Lewis went to Oxford to be a teacher. He did teach in literature, so he definitely knew a lot about literature. And early in his teaching career at Oxford, he met J.R.R. Tolkien. I think you guys all know who Tolkien is. And so, the guy who wrote The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, Silmarillion. Sadly, there's this abomination on Amazon called The Rings of Power. And so I'm sure Tolkien would probably have nothing to do with that, but that's a whole other stream, right? But anyway, they met at a faculty meeting, and they became friends because of their shared interest in literature and mythology and all of these other different things. And Tolkien was a Catholic, and he left a significant influence on Lewis. Tolkien introduced to Lewis the concept that all myths could contain at least a thread of truth, like fractured fragments of God's true reality. And so Tolkien was kind of like, the reason why we create these myths, the reason why we have this kind of innate desire to create myths, is largely because we're made in the image of God. We're like sub-creators, and so some interesting thoughts that he injected into Lewis there. He also introduced the idea of eucatastrophe in storytelling, where tragedy ultimately leads to a happily ever after ending. You definitely see this theme strongly throughout his books, particularly in The Lord of the Rings. And for Tolkien, the death and resurrection of Jesus, it actually represented the ultimate eucatastrophe. Okay. And so Lewis, with these thoughts, went back and he did re-examine the Gospels. And of course, you guys know the story. He became a very famous Christian writer, apologist, author, kind of a philosopher in his own right. It's obviously published dozens and dozens of books, whether they're theological in nature or fiction. And so I don't really have to fill you into too much of the details there. But in Lewis's reexamination of the Gospels, this is one thing that he said in a book titled, or an essay, I should say, titled Fern Seeds and Elephants. Okay. And in this particular essay, what Lewis was addressing was there was a lot of the modern higher kind of criticism that was creeping into like the Anglican Church. And you have seen this leftward drift with the Anglican Church, not so much in North America. I mean, unless you're counting Episcopals, but you see it to this day with some of the leftward drift that they're doing with some of the social issues. But a lot of that started with the higher criticism, the theology, and different things like that, from Tillich, Bultmann, Vidler, and different things like that. And Lewis was reacting to it because he read the higher critics. And let's just say he brought his literary critical skills to what they were saying and just was not impressed. And so this is Lewis. He says, I've been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, myths all my life. I know what they're like. I know that not one of them is like this, referring to the Gospels. Of this text, there are two possible views. Either this is reportage, though it may no doubt contain errors pretty close up to the facts, nearly as close as Boswell, or else some unknown writer in the 2nd century, without known predecessors or successors, suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern novelistic, realistic narrative. If it is untrue, it must be a narrative of that kind. The reader who doesn't see this simply has not learned to read. And so there's the pixel shades, cue up the Snoop Dogg music there. Lewis is not pulling any punches. He's just basically pulling an apologetics thug life here by just saying that you guys, if you are reading these particular texts, and if you think that they're just like any other myths or any other legends, you're just not reading them very closely. And so I didn't say that. That's what Lewis says. He's pretty strong there in what he has to say. And so there are superficial similarities between myths and legends and the Gospels. And Lewis would actually be one of the first people to acknowledge that. Okay. And we're going to talk about that more as we go along, because Lewis later wrote an essay called Myth Became Fact. And so he's talking about the mythical elements that we see in the Gospels, but Jesus is the myth made fact. And so let's dig in a little bit. Superficial similarities. I mean, there's prophets or oracles, divine messengers. You have Hermes, you have Gabriel, the angel, divine offspring. You have all kinds of supernatural birth stories and other pagan religions and myths and different things like that. Of course, Jesus was born from a supernatural birth. You have John the Baptist, who was born from a supernatural birth. You have Old Testament figures that were born, beyond when they should have been able to be born, right? There's supernatural worlds, underworlds or realms of the dead, like Hades and Sheol and all kinds of other things like that. There's divine interventions. You have healings, exorcisms, even the existence of angels and demons and different things like that. You have nature miracles, supernatural births. Again, these are things that you would see similar in pagan mythology, right? You would see these kind of things. People bring up these things all the time, right? There's like the wedding of Cana. People bring that up. Well, you have Bacchus, and people try and draw comparisons there. Sacred rituals and rites. I mean, you definitely have sacred rituals and Mithraism and different things like that. Well, there's sacred rituals in Christianity, like baptism and the Last Supper and different things like that. And then there's common tropes. There's moral teachings that are peppered throughout these kinds of stories. Jesus also speaks in parables and different things like that. We see trials and temptations, the temptation of Jesus in the desert. Well, we see those kind of tropes again in different kind of mythology. martyrdom and sacrifice, dying and rising gods, of course, that's a big one. Osiris and different things like that, ascensions. People talk about the apotheosis, that's a fun word to say, of Romulus and different things like that. And so it's like there are these common tropes, there are these common themes, right? But there are also some major differences between the Gospels and legends and myths. The Gospels claim to be historical accounts, while myth and legends often lack such claims. Now, that's not to say that there are not legends and stories and different things like that that make their way into historical accounts. Okay, I'm not denying that at all. Okay, we see exaggerations and different supernatural stories in things like Tacitus and Josephus and others. And so I'm not denying that. I'm just saying that the Gospels are claiming to be historical accounts. Myths and legends specifically are not usually claiming those things. And then if we want to talk about different miracle claims in some of these other historical books, well, I would just say, go back to my video where I talk about the doubts criteria and different things like that. That's not something we're going to go over in this particular video, but it's been covered before. Genre. The Gospels are written in a historical genre. They seem to be aiming for accuracy, at least, whereas myth and legends may be more focused on storytelling and symbolism. Contemporary sources. The Gospels are written within lifetime of witnesses or within a generation of the events, while many myths and legends have their origins in more distant times, or sometimes in places that don't even exist. Persecution context. The Gospels include claims made in a context of persecution, which indicates a sincere belief in their accuracy. And so that's something to consider. I'm not saying it's the only thing to consider, but it's something to consider. And I'm not saying that all of these things just have like ultra strong evidential weight. I'm just highlighting some differences here. Okay. Other markers between the Gospels and legends and myths. In the Gospels, we've talked about this in our last stream. They contain undesigned coincidences, casual and incidental details that interlock with each other that mutually support their authenticity, incidental allusions. We've talked about this in the Acts stream before, right? So go back and watch the previous streams, and kind of everything is sort of building on one thing on top of another with these streams. The Gospels include indirect and naturally confirmed references from sources outside of the Bible, right? And so there's just multiple difficult, obscure facts that we can actually cross-check and verify in history that the Gospel authors actually get right. Reconcilable variations, differences within the Gospels, which can actually be easily harmonized. I'm not talking about strained harmonization, but things that can be easily harmonized suggests multiple authentic perspectives. It suggests independence, and it suggests that when they're easily harmonizable, that's what we would expect on eyewitness testimony. When they're just like hopelessly contradictory, that's what we would expect if people are lying, right? Unnecessary details. The Gospels could include details that may seem extraneous for fiction, but enhance historical credibility. This part might be a little dry. I apologize. We're going to get into some interesting stuff, though, so hang tight, all right? And unexplained references. References in the Gospels that lack the typical hallmarks of deliberate fabrication, unity of character, of personalities. Characters in the Gospels exhibit consistent, realistic personalities throughout. And so these are hallmarks of testimony, right? Of history, of things that are actually people who are close up to the facts writing about the events, right? Well, in legends and myths, the writing quality we see is a little bit different. They're crudely written. They're very purple, melodramatic. There's use of excessive embellishment sometimes, while the Gospels aim for straightforward historical accounts. You definitely see this writing quality when you compare the apocryphal Gospels with the four Gospels as well. Temporal distance. Many legends were not written within the lifetime of witnesses or contemporaneous sources. Sometimes they're often written, far, far away and long time ago, that kind of thing. Lacking key testimonial features like the ones that we just talked about. They can lack essential elements of credible testimony, such as corroborating evidence or context-specific details, again, like the examples that we just went through. All right. And so Lewis, in this very same essay on the fern seeds and elephants, basically, he says that he's a sheep, and he's kind of railing against the shepherds who are buying into this higher criticism. And he says he has different bleats, right? He's just kind of, at some of the things that he's seeing, and not in a good way. One of the things that he pointed out with these critics who are saying, maybe the Gospels are partially historical, but largely fictional and legendary, is that a lot of this is stemming from a very heavy anti-supernatural bias. Okay. He says that he finds in these theologians a constant use of the principle that the miraculous doesn't occur. Thus, any statement put into our Lord's mouth by the old text, which, if he really had made it, would constitute a prediction of the future, is taken to mean that it was put in after the occurrence which it seemed to predict. This is a very sensible thing if we start by knowing inspired prediction can never occur. Similarly, in general, the rejection as unhistorical of all passages which narrate miracles is sensible if we start by knowing the miraculous in general never occurs. And so basically he's saying that you guys are just bringing a very naturalistic, kind of Humean bias into the text when you read them. And so when you are reading, say, Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, you're saying that the gospel writers just put that into Jesus's mouth to make him look like a more impressive prophet. Well, why do we say that? Well, a weak argument, we're just assuming that doesn't happen. Okay. And so Lewis is bucking up against that. Lewis, as a literary critic, also was used to people reviewing his own books and trying to be like, well, maybe Lewis was thinking this, and maybe he was thinking that, and, maybe this character symbolizes such and so forth. And Lewis would be amused at reading people who were contemporaries of his, reading his materials, picking apart special secret meanings and a lot of different things. And he's like, no, that's wrong. That's wrong. Aslan didn't really come from here. I didn't really borrow him from this particular book or this particular character. That's not where the inspiration came from and different things like that. And so he urges agnosticism when it comes to literary criticism of the Bible, because if these are contemporaries, how much worse off is it for people who are 2,000 years later, separated by all kinds of custom and language and different things like that? Let's be careful about doing too much like armchair history here. And so he says, I cannot describe the history of even my own thoughts as confidently as these men describe the history of the early church's minds. And I am perfectly certain no one else could. Suppose a future scholar knew that I had abandoned Christianity in my teens, and that also in my teens I went to an atheist tutor. Wouldn't this seem far better evidence than most of what we have about the development of Christian theology in the first 2 centuries? Would not he conclude that my apostasy was due to the tutor, and then reject as a backward projection any story which represented me as an atheist before I went to the tutor? Yet he would be wrong. I am sorry to have become once more autobiographical, but reflection on the extreme improbability of his own life by historical standards seems to me to be a profitable exercise for everyone. It encourages due agnosticism. And so you see this kind of a priori history by biblical scholars all the time. It's like a really bad habit. I saw Paula Friedrichsen say, well, Paul would have never had, permission from the Sanhedrin because to go arrest and persecute Christians, because under Roman law, they didn't have that kind of authority and that kind of power. But we know from Josephus that these guys had all kinds of shady dealings and were doing all kinds of things, under the table, and were not, the nicest people in the world. And so we're just doing history from our armchair, or somebody has also said, I read a critic say, well, the Sadducees, which made up most of the Sanhedrin, they would have never worked with Paul, a Pharisee, because the Sadducees and the Pharisees could not stand each other. Well, again, this is armchair history. Sometimes an enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so it's like, well, why not, enlist somebody who's more than willing to do it, even if you don't normally agree about certain theological issues. You got a common enemy here. And so you just see this bad habit among biblical scholars all the time, a priori history. You see it with Pilate. He would never release, we don't have any statements of him releasing prisoners, like Barabbas, before crucifixions or different things like that, before Passover and stuff like that. So, the gospel writers, they must be just making this up. Well, again, this is a priori history. We should have a little bit more agnosticism about our overconfidence making these statements, especially when we have, sources that are pretty good sources that were probably there. And so anyways, I could go off on that, but One more thing here on Lewis's opinion of biblical critics, and then we're going to get back to the mythology and all that other kind of stuff, and why Christianity, Lewis didn't see it as just another mythology after further examining the text. But scholarly consensus. People love their scholarly consensus. They love their biblical scholars. They love their biblical critics. They feel like it's safe, like biblical studies is like, it's like a science, right? Like we got to stay within the consensus because, that's the safe place. And these guys are basically like scientists, and the more that we learn, the more that we know about the text as we go on, and we can just continue to build theories upon theories upon theories. And, what we learned now is way better than what we had in the past. Well, Lewis wasn't really impressed with this whole idea of scholarly consensus. And he says that I've learned in other fields of study how transitory the assured results of modern scholarship may be, and how soon the scholarship ceases to be modern. The confident treatments to which the New Testament is subjected is no longer applied to profane text. There used to be dozens of English scholars who were prepared to cut up Henry VI between half a dozen authors and assign his share to each. We don't do that now. When I was a boy, one would have been laughed at for supposing there would have been a real Homer. Now the disintegrators seem to have triumphed forever, but Homer seems to be creeping back, or the disintegrators seem to have triumphed forever. Even the belief of the ancient Greeks that the Mycenaeans were their ancestors and spoke Greek has been surprisingly supported. We may without disgrace now believe in a historical author, Arthur, like King Arthur, right? Camelot. Everywhere except in theology, there's been a vigorous growth of skepticism about skepticism itself. And so Lewis is just basically saying, like, I know about literary criticism. We're changing our minds all the time. Okay. We understand that scholarly consensus is like shifting sand. All right. And so Lewis is saying basically the same thing here, or history, right? History is a discipline. Consensus often can shift, can often change. And so this whole idea of like scholarly consensus is like, well, I have the scholars on my side. Like Lewis is like, so what? Big deal. Like that can change very rapidly. All right, so getting back to what Lewis said about Jesus being the myth that became fact. He later wrote another essay. I think it was published in Christian Reflections, although I could be wrong with that. Maybe it's God in the Dock. I think Fern Seeds and Elephants was actually in Christian Reflections. But anyway, he talks about the myth that became fact and how Jesus does have all these mythical qualities that we do see, but he is different, okay, because of the historical qualities that we're going to talk about even more. And so he says, this is a kind of the money quote from his essay. It's a little bit long, but hang with me. He says, now as myth transcends thought, incarnation transcends myth. The heart of Christianity is a myth, which is also a fact. The old myth of the dying God, without ceasing to be myth, comes down from heaven of legend and imagination to the earth of history. It happens at a particular date in a particular place, followed by definable historical consequences. We pass from a Balder or an Osiris dying nobody knows when or where to a historical person crucified. It is all in order under Pontius Pilate. And so I'm sure Richard Carrier is punching the air right now, because Jesus is crucified by the principalities and powers in outer space, Anyway, I digress. By becoming fact, it does not cease to become myth. That is the miracle. I suspect that men have sometimes derived more spiritual sustenance from myths they did not believe than from the religion they professed. To be truly Christian, we must both assent to the historical fact and also receive the myth, fact though it has become, with some imaginative embrace, which we accord to all myths. This is hardly more necessary than the other. Those who do not know that this great myth became fact when the Virgin conceived are indeed to be pitied, but the Christians are to be reminded that what became fact was a myth, that it carries with it into the world a fact, all the properties of a myth. God is no more God, or God is more than God, not less. Christ is more than Balder, not less. We must not be ashamed of the mythical radiance resting in our theology. We must not be nervous about parallels or pagan Christ. They ought to be there. That's an interesting statement right there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't. We must not, in false spirituality, withhold our imaginative welcome. If God chooses to be mythopoeic, And is not the sky itself a myth? Shall we refuse to become mythopathic? For this is the marriage of heaven and earth, perfect myth and perfect fact, claiming not only our love and our obedience, but also our wonder and delight addressed to the savage, the child, and the poet in each one of us, and no less than the moralist, the scholar, and the philosopher. And so, hear what Lewis is saying here. Okay, when you read the Gospels, right now, we're going to argue, and Lewis is going to argue that they are reportage, right, close up to the facts, right? But at the same time, they do have these striking features, because I mean, what are you expecting? Like, I guess, what are the critics expecting? Like, if Jesus was going to, if God was going to become incarnate, right, and reveal himself to the world in a powerful way through miracles, isn't it going to take some kind of features of myth, right? Isn't it going to speak to our like most existential needs, our desires, right? What are we expecting the Gospels to read like? Like a modern day Associated Press story, right? Like that. I don't think that's going to have the same kind of profound impact, right? We're going to see like beauty and morals and deep truths and all kinds of profound things. If God is going to speak to us in Revelation, it's not just going to read like, a newspaper report. Okay. And so, yeah, it's basically what I'm saying here, summing it up. If God intended to convey an important message through a historical miracle, wouldn't it just naturally have a touch of the mythical, right? Wouldn't it just all by itself just have some of that touch, some of that flavor to it, because it has these elements, right? There's angels, there's demons, there's visions, there's resurrections, right? There's multiplication of food, there's healings and all kinds of other things. There's water being turned to wine, and on and on and on. And so, of course, naturally, it's going to have a touch of the mythical, but we don't want to make like an association fallacy and just be like, okay, well, I see this in other literature, therefore it just automatically is false. Now, you might say it automatically has a high standard that it needs to pass in order for me to rationally accept it because of all of these other myths. But you have to at least have a way to know that you're wrong. If God actually did something in the past, how are you going to know if you're wrong that he didn't, right? You have to allow for some sort of like criteria and examination in order to make that determination. Otherwise, you're being closed-minded at that point. So this is the most important part, but hang with the rest of the stream, because we're going to talk about some examples here. The failure of these people who make this like, well, the Gospels are just derived from the Old Testament, or the Gospels are just derived from Greco-Roman mythology or pagan mythology. Okay. When people claim that the Gospels might be legends or must be legends even due to the similarities with pagan or Greek stories, they suggest that the Gospels are more like fiction, but it's important to consider if some of these similarities would also be expected in historical accounts. If the Gospels are true history, it's natural to expect some common themes and tropes with other ancient tales, given the cultural and literary context of the time. Similarities can arise from shared storytelling conventions, okay? So it's, again, the Gospel authors, they're not writing as 2023 Associated Press reporters, right? They're going to have at least some, I'm not saying all, we need to be careful that we don't exaggerate this a little bit too much, but they probably are going to be using some of the shared storytelling conventions of the time, right? If the Gospels feature supernatural events, well, it's reasonable to expect similar elements in other tales and myths, right? It's also not surprising if God worked miracles in the Gospels designed specifically to resemble stories that people were already familiar with, okay? And so, for example, Jesus' feeding of the 5,000. People have compared that, and they're just saying, well, Elisha fed 100 men. He multiplied food, and he fed a bunch of people. Maybe the Gospel authors just kind of decided, what, let's make a cool story that Jesus is like Elisha, but even cooler, right? And so, well, maybe, just maybe, if this really did happen, people who were actually like witnesses to the event would make that connection and just be like, wow, like Jesus is a more profound prophet than Elisha. Who is he, right? Supernatural birth stories. People talk all the time about all these different supernatural birth stories of maybe Roman emperors, maybe other pagan parallel gods. Now, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, these parallels are really, really weak. Okay, and Christian apologists have really spent a lot of time like, no, 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 these are terrible parallels. Okay, Danae in the shower of gold, and Mary just saying, "Be it unto me according to thy word." Pretty different. Okay, and we could go that route. Sure, that's fine. But like, if Jesus, if he's trying to relate, if God is trying to relate a story to people, future Gentiles or Jews who are familiar with supernatural birth stories, like say Isaac or Samson or different things like that, they might be like, oh, wow, cool. Ascension narratives, right? We hear about that in pagan stories. Well, we also hear about that in Elijah, ascending into heaven, or Enoch being translated. Okay. Again, why can't God like repeat himself with his own messenger? Like eventually, like what is he supposed to do? Right. We also are aware of significant events with rich symbolism, such as Jesus's crucifixion on Passover, right? But this evidence for the crucifixion is very compelling, right? Jesus was crucified. It happened on Passover. Most people agree with that. Most people don't really have a big problem with that. There's of course the idea Jesus is the Passover lamb. St. Paul even says so in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. But that doesn't mean that like Jesus wasn't really crucified, unless you're going full myther or something like that. And so again, if God is trying to appeal to a culture where divine births, stories, resurrections were a means of recognizing God, then it would make sense for God to perform those actions to demonstrate his divinity. Therefore, these similarities, now get this is the important part. These similarities are expected whether the gospels are true or whether they are legendary. Okay. And so you can't have a hypothesis that says, well, that the gospels are just copying all these pagan myths, or all these pagan stories, or all these Old Testament stories, when if that's the hypothesis that we're going to hang our hat on, and we know it because of these parallels. Well, my hypothesis, reported hypothesis, predicts basically the same thing. Okay, and so it's just like we make the same predictions, therefore big deal. So what? Like this isn't going to work. Okay, you're going to have to come up with other ways to argue against the gospels. If you want to use this, I guess, as like one tool in your arsenal, I suppose, but I think this is like very, very, very weak when skeptics, when critics are making these points and saying, look, it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, therefore it's a duck. No, that's not going to work. Okay. More evidence is what we actually need that can't be easily explained by their historical nature. And collecting more examples of parallels. And so just making bigger and bigger list of all kinds of parallels from all kinds of other different literature, or gaining support from scholars in the field who think, oh, they use this literature, or they use this literature. They use the Old Testament, they used Homer, they used other Greco-Roman myths and this, that. That's only going to get you so far. Okay. Good reasoning requires evidence that clearly favors one idea over the other. In this case, mere similarities aren't sufficient evidence. Okay. And so it's also, this is another thing, it's also entirely possible to find parallels from biblical, pagan, or other fictional literature in actual historical events. If you look hard enough, you could find them all over the place, right? And so this fact alone does not invalidate the historical authenticity of the events described in the Gospels or other ancient texts. You've heard Harriet Tubman, right? She was a big part of the Underground Railroad that was helping get slaves, smuggling them to the north and helping them find freedom and different things like that. Well, a lot of times she was compared to Moses, right? People have made comparisons to Napoleon, to like Alexander the Great and different things like that. And people have compared Alexander the Great to like Achilles and different things like that. But those are historical figures. We can find parallels in all kinds of different things, right? It's just kind of the way the human mind works. We like patterns. We like parallels, okay? This one, we'll give credit to Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy. In one of his videos, he brings out that there's a fictional novel called Futility by a guy by the name of Morgan Robertson. It was published in 1898. And it's really eerily, freaky, similar to the real life sinking of the Titanic in 1912. It features a fictional ocean liner named the SS Titan. Okay, Titan, Titanic, there you go. Both the Titan and the Titanic were described as unsinkable, the largest ships of their time. Both were around 800 feet long, had the capacity of around 300 or 3,000 passengers. Both the Titan and Titanic meet their fate by colliding with an iceberg in the North Atlantic. The Titan sinks in April, just like the Titanic. The Titan's sinking date is April 15th, while the Titanic sank on April 15 to 16, depending on the time zone. In both stories, there were insufficient lifeboats for the numbers of passengers on board. And so, cue all the Titanic memes there. But anyway, yeah, a lot of similarities, right? Shortage of life jackets, right? There was a shortage of both. There's a high casualty rate. And so significant loss of life, speed and weather. Both ships were traveling at a high speed through icy waters and encountered the iceberg. Poor visibility due to fog was the factor in both disasters. Warnings ignored. The warnings about the presence of ice in the area were ignored by both ships' crews. And so, obviously, yeah, Spartan's got the right idea here. And so all this tells me is that the Titanic is a myth, LOL. Exactly, right? These parallels, a clever mythicist, 2,000 years from now, or whatever, could look at this and go, clearly this is all made up. Clearly this is both are fiction. And this is historical fiction, right? Remember, that's the genre that Lewis says the Gospels are not, because the genre of this kind of fiction didn't exist until like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later. Okay. And so yeah, we need to be careful about parallelomania. There you go. So revisiting some markers of truth. I'm not going to reread all of these, but we are going to cover 3 of these. I'm going to give you a few examples of why Lewis probably recognized that the Gospels were different. Now, he doesn't use all of these in his essays, but he does kind of note some of these. And these have been fleshed out more in Lydia McGrew's book, Testimonies to the Truth. You could also see her book on the Gospel of John, Eye of the Beholder, where she gives a bunch of examples of some of these, as well as The Mirror or the Mask. And so I highly recommend all of those. Definitely get the scholarly books if you really want to nerd out. If you're into biblical studies and you're like, ew, the McGrews, because you've heard bad things on Twitter or whatever, X, whatever we call it now, go back and read those ones, because those are, I think, like they're addressing scholars, so those might like tickle your fancy more. If you're a beginner, check out Testimonies of the Truth or Hidden in Plain View. All right, so these pieces of evidence that I'm going to go through here, they make it less likely that the Gospels are myths, embellishments, or fictions, because they would match what we would expect from the documents based on real testimonies. Now, to clarify, just because somebody inevitably is going to be like, oh man, I'm gonna grab a clip of this video and I'm gonna make Eric look so stupid. I'm gonna own this Fundy. Okay, just to clarify, I am not saying that the one and only explanation for these markers. I looked down because I think I saw my cat down there and she must have snuck her way in. Anyways, let me say that again. I am not saying that the one and only explanation for these markers is the authenticity of the related accounts. Rather, what we are arguing is that these evidence serve as evidence supporting the hypothesis of the authenticity, because they are more likely if the accounts are true rather than if they are false. So the mere presence of alternative scenarios doesn't just automatically debunk what I'm going to say here, as long as those scenarios are less likely than the hypothesis, then the accounts are based on truth. Okay, so let's rewind real quick. What I'm saying here, going back, the hypothesis that, walks like a duck, sounds like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's predicted. Okay, it's predicted on both. All right, a black swan is going to look like a swan, but it's going to be a black swan. Okay, swans are swan. Swans are all white, right? No, well, there can be a black swan. Okay, and so the prediction that they're going to basically sound the same, flap their wings the same, and do everything else the same is on both hypotheses. Okay, But what we wouldn't expect is these other markers of truth in mythical stories, but we would expect them in true stories. And so I'm trying to like say there's an asymmetry here. Okay. So sample. I'm going to run through these kind of quick here. Unnecessary details. Unnecessary details serve as an indication of an intention to present a narrative as historical. Such elements are not typically found in openly ahistorical or legendary content. The inclusion of these vivid and overly realistic details can either be a sign of authenticity or hear me out here, a deliberate attempt to deceive by presenting narrative as history when it is clearly not. Okay. And so there's that caveat there. So, be careful. Again, don't say that I'm saying things that I'm not. So some examples of unnecessary details in the Gospels. We get precise locations where John the Baptist was baptizing, Bethany beyond the Jordan, which is true. We do know that that's where that Bethany is beyond the Jordan, right? John 1:28, Anan is near Salim. Okay, those are details that that are just kind of mentioned, these extraneous details. The time of day when John the Baptist's disciples went with Jesus to his lodging around the 10th hour. So just this kind of unnecessary detail is the 10th hour is what John tells us. John also tells us the number of water pots at the marriage of Cana and their size. There were 6 of them, containing 20 to 30 gallons. Now, it's always amusing to listen to biblical critics try and find like symbolic meaning, in all of these, like 6. Okay, well, what's 6? 6 is the day before how many days there are before the Sabbath or something like that. It's just like you could find symbolic details and all these things if you really want to try. You could do it with 153 fish. I've seen it attempted. It's pretty ridiculous. But it just starts to get way more complex and way more complicated, right? The time when Jesus was sitting by the well at Sychar, about the 6th hour, that Jesus was asleep on a pillow in a boat. Okay. If you want to find some sort of, Mark is the only one who gives us this kind of extraneous detail. If you want to find some sort of like special symbolic meaning of why Jesus was laying on a pillow, we'll go for it, I guess. Or maybe Matthew and Luke took out that detail because he's like, no, he's God, he's a big time divine figure. We got to take this pillow out, okay, if you want to go get that wacky with your redaction criticism, feel free to make yourself look kind of silly. 7 baskets full of leftovers after the feeding of the 4,000, and a different number for the word, a different number and a different word for basket after the feeding of the 5,000. And so in Mark 8:8, there's, I think it was, 7 baskets full, the number I just read there. But the word used for basket is actually a different word used for basket in Mark chapter 6. And it's the same word for the basket that Paul was let down when he escaped from King Aretas, right? And so that's kind of interesting right there. It's got to be some pretty big baskets, but they're 2 separate words. It's kind of this unnecessary detail. I mean, unless Mark was thinking like, oh gosh, I got to use a different word for basket. I got to, make something more impressive because it's only 7 this time, but no, they were big baskets. Again, if that's the kind of authors you think that the gospel writers are, I think you're introducing more complexity than is necessary at that point. The number of porticos at the pool of Bethesda, 5. John says there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which is in Aramaic called Bethesda, which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Okay, well, that's kind of interesting. It's just random detail. Yeah, there were 5 colonnades. Okay. Interestingly enough, some biblical critics, at least it seems to have, they suggested, this is Alfred Loisy, one of the critics that Lewis actually himself read and kind of criticizes, is Loisy said that the ancients who thought that they found in the spring a symbol of Judaism, and in the 5 porticos an allusion to the 5 books of the law, no doubt incurred the thought of the evangelists. And so Loisy is kind of thinking that maybe, it seems to be, at least to me, suggesting that John just made up this detail 5 covered colonnades because, colonnades, the books of the law, that's cool. That's got symbolism. Well, archaeology, as you can see here, here's the 5th covered colonnade that was discovered in the last, I want to say 80 years or so, has actually confirmed this particular detail. So that's that one particular kind of example. There are many, many others. Of course, there's like Mark talks about the grass being green. That's a very famous undesigned coincidence. We're not going to get into that. See my previous stream on that. But like there's lots of these unnecessary details, right? Unexplained references. In an unexplained allusion or reference, a speaker or author mentions something in passing that the original audience probably wouldn't have understood. The storyteller is so engrossed in their tale that they don't stop to provide an explanation. Unexplained allusions might seem like a flaw in realistic fiction because they disrupt the narrative flow and leave readers perplexed. Paradoxically, it is this very disruption that can be seen as an evidence for truth. And so, again, people want to say that like the gospel writers, they're really, really, really clever. They're trying to create this appearance of verisimilitude, and they're being very cautious, they're being very careful, but then they also just drop these weird unexplained references that just seem to serve absolutely no literary purpose at all, and in fact work against that literary purpose. Okay, so just to give like a real life illustration, if I tell you that I had to rush to meet the HMA at the church for the upcoming kids HALP event, you might wonder what the heck is an HMA and what is HALP? Help me. But then I mentioned getting pulled over for going 10 miles over the limit along the way. I mentioned this detail because in the moment, my focus on the story, I'm not carefully shaping it for the audience, right? I'm not stopping to explain and to make sure that everybody understands what I'm talking about. I'm speaking candidly, leading to the use of a phrase that most in my audience may not know. Okay, so this is just kind of a marker of like what truthful testimony on an everyday basis looks like. You could probably all think of your own kind of examples. By the way, HMA is Help's ministry administrator, and HALP is the Hallelujah Party, because we Christians cannot have a Halloween party. It's got to be trunk or treat or the Hallelujah Party or something else. But interestingly enough, we did have a real like ultra fundamentalist protester get mad at us because there was kids in our church with costumes on, and so anyways, there you go. If you really wanted to understand that about my 200-member church there. Unexplained references. So let's give some examples. Mark 3:17 tells us that the Zebedee brothers were given the nickname Sons of Thunder. Mark never even bothers to tell us why. That's kind of weird. That's just an unexplained reference. Mark 13:1-5 tells us about some Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with sacrifices. If Luke knows what happened, he definitely is not pausing to explain it to us. He is more interested in sharing what Jesus said than making sure Theophilus, his patron, understood, who probably wasn't necessarily from the area. But of course, we know Pilate, and this is totally in keeping with his character. But Luke doesn't even bother to explain. Can any good thing come out of Nazareth, right? Nathaniel's famous question. We never learn what that comment is even about, and it plays no further role in John's gospel. So it's just like, we're never told why Nazareth has this bad rap in John's gospel at all. John isn't probably writing his gospel in Palestine, okay? It's probably somewhere else. People think Ephesus or wherever. Yeah, it's just kind of weird. It's just this unexplained reference. After the miracle in Cana, we're told that Jesus, his mother's, and his brother's disciples go down to Capernaum for a few days, which, interestingly enough, Cana has an elevation, I forget how many feet, and Capernaum has basically they're separated by about like 1,000 something meters of elevation. So they would actually have to go down. This is something that Peter J. Williams notes. But we're never told, like, what do? It just jumps immediately to the cleansing of the temple. Like, we don't know what's going on. It's just this unexplained reference of them going down to Capernaum for a few days. John 3:25-26, there's this dispute between John the Baptist's disciples and a Jew regarding purification. Okay. And then switch the scene. These guys go to John. John starts talking about, I must decrease so that he might increase and all this other stuff. Like there's no resolution. It's just this unexplained reference, right? And so one more example of verisimilitude in the gospel accounts is unity of character. The Gospels compellingly illustrate the authenticity of their characters by consistently portraying subtle similarities in their personalities across various stories. This natural consistency would be difficult to fabricate. This continuity extends to the way Jesus thinks, teaches, and interacts with others, whether in the Gospel of John or the Synoptic Gospels, and you do hear that a lot. Oh, John's Jesus is just so different, right? But when you really look at the subtle characteristics, we're going to see that he's really not. And this affirms the historical authenticity of Jesus's character. And so characters are just kind of hard to get right and keep consistent throughout, right? I think of, and this isn't the greatest example, but this is just an example. I think of like Leslie Knope in Parks and Rec. In the first season, which wasn't particularly good, Leslie is a doofus, right? She's an idiot. She's kind of like a bumbler. She's like Michael Scott, sort of, only just not as maybe doesn't have as much of a dirty mind as Michael. But anyways, she's just a bumbler. She's a doofus. And then by the time you get to like the last season, she's a super genius, you know, in Office and all this other stuff, and you know, super competent, can multitask, do everything right. Still quirky, still goofy, still funny, but not exactly the same character at all. You see it even with Chris Pratt's character. Like he kind of evolves. He's real selfish. He's just completely rude and callous. And then like all of a sudden he's the world's greatest boyfriend, you know? And it's just like, how is this the same guy? Right. And so characters are kind of hard to fake. Again, I know it's TV. It's not an apples for apples, one for one comparison, but you get the point. Jesus's wit and wordplay. So these are subtle characteristics of Jesus's character, not like the obvious ones. Okay. In Luke 13:15-17, there's a woman who's bowed over on the Sabbath. Jesus is there preaching in the synagogue, and she's been that way for 18 years, right? And Jesus says, "You hypocrites, doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound these 18 long years, be free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" And when he said this, all his opponents were humiliated. You know, cue the thug life music. Jesus puts on the pixel shades. But anyways, and so he's basically like, you guys care more about animals than you care about people. You're a bunch of hypocrites. And he just kind of has this sharp wit, and he uses some wordplay here. And then again, people tell us John's Jesus, he's so different. Here he makes a woman whole. And then in John 7, it says, Jesus said to them, "I did one miracle, you're all amazed, yet Moses gave you circumcision, though that actually didn't come from Moses, but from the patriarchs. You circumcise a boy on the Sabbath." Now, if a boy can be circumcised on the Sabbath, so you're taking a part away so that the law of Moses may not be broken, why are you angry at me for healing a man's whole body on the Sabbath? Stop judging by mere appearances. Instead, judge correctly. And so you can see the consistency of character here. He's got wit. He's got wordplay. He's calling them hypocrites. He's talking about, you know, these different things with, you know, making people whole. And in this particular case, like, you're circumcising a baby on the 8th day, you're taking a part of his body away, a little part, and then you basically he's healing. But you're mad at me because I made a man completely whole on the Sabbath. Like, what is wrong with you people, right? And so there you go. Jesus turns away compliments. This is a consistent characteristic of Jesus in all of the Gospels. Here's an example. As Jesus said these things, a woman in the crowd raised her voice, saying to him, "Blessed is the womb that bore you and the breast at which you nursed." What was Jesus's response? Did he just take the compliment and be like, "Oh yeah, definitely, you know, Hail Mary, full of grace"? Catholics, don't get offended at me. I'm just kidding. Actually, I don't think this is a good verse, Protestants, to use against Catholics, so just don't. But that's neither here nor there. I just brought that up to make sure you guys are awake and maybe just poke a bear or two there. Blessed rather are those who hear the word and keep it, is what Jesus says. Okay, that's how he responds. So he turns away a compliment when it's being thrown at him. Well, we see this in John. Nicodemus, "Rabbi, we know you're a teacher that has come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him." Again, what was Jesus' response? He's not having it. He's not being buttered up here. He's not taking it. Okay, he's just not like, "Oh, well, thank you." You know, no, he says, "Truly, truly." He just changes the subject. Unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. And so he just completely changes the subject. He brings up more pressing and more important spiritual matters, just like you see in Luke. Here's another example. Then a teacher of the law came to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." What was Jesus' response? This is in Matthew. He says, "Nope, I'm not having it. Foxes have dens, birds have nests. The Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Jesus started on his way. Here's another example. This is the rich young ruler. He comes up and says, "Good teacher, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? Jesus was like, why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. And so he's every time somebody is trying to pay him some sort of a compliment, we just see this consistent portrayal of him being like, no, I'm shifting that off me, and I'm going to bring up something to that, a more important spiritual point. Now you could say, well, yeah, they're just trying to do this. This is all by design. I'm not saying that's not possible, but this consistency, I think, speaks more probable on the hypothesis that these are people who know about these stories, are close up to the facts, and they're getting this consistent character right. If they weren't, we would expect, more divergence, I guess. Jesus was sarcastic. And so another example, but I know that you have not the love of God within you, for I have come in my Father's name and you did not receive me. If another comes in his name, you will receive him. And bar kokba, enough said there. But obviously John is probably not writing at all with that in mind, where in Luke, we see the same Jesus, right? Some Pharisees were like, hey, Jesus, you better get out of here. Herod wants to kill you. And Jesus is like, hey, go tell that fox I cast out demons, perform cures today and tomorrow. On the third day, I finished my course. Nevertheless, I must go my way today and tomorrow and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish away from Jerusalem. And so he's just kind of being biting here. He's being sarcastic. It's like, you guys will just follow somebody else who comes in his own name. And, God forbid that a prophet dies somewhere else, but besides Jerusalem, like, he's not going to touch me. And so there's this kind of like sharp sarcasticness that's consistent throughout all of the Gospels. One more example from Jesus. Jesus was indignant, right? Now, granted, this is a variant reading, and the NIV actually uses this reading in their text, but most translations don't. They just are picking the harder reading. More of the manuscripts that we have say that Jesus was moved with compassion when it comes to the man with leprosy in Mark chapter 1. But there is one manuscript, and it is the harder reading, so some people do favor it, including critics like Bart Ehrman, that Jesus wasn't compassionate with the guy with leprosy. He was actually indignant, okay? Now, I don't think he was indignant necessarily with the leper, and that's a whole other topic. Maybe he was just indignant with God's creation being marred through the curse and the fall and Satan and everything else. But anyways, he reached out his hand and touched the man. He said, I am willing, be clean. So we see this indignance from Jesus, right? We also see the same thing when the people brought the children to him, and the disciples were like, get out of here. He doesn't have time for these kids. Mark says Jesus was indignant and said, no, bring them to me, right? Well, what are you talking about? The kingdom is for these kinds, right? These children. Mark 3:4-5. And then Jesus asked him, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or evil, to save life or kill? They remained silent. He looked at them in anger, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and said, stretch out your hand. And so he's angry. He's indignant. He's upset. He's irritated at the lack of compassion. We just saw it, the same thing in the previous example, right? You guys care more about circumcising a baby on the Sabbath or taking care of an oxen and pulling them out of the ditch on the Sabbath than you actually do about like healing somebody. Like, what the heck is wrong with you people? All right. But we see this same indignance in the Gospel of John. This is, of course, the famous story about Lazarus being raised in John 11:33-35. It says, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, and we'll look at that a little bit more in a second, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her weeping, it says that he was deeply moved in spirit. And it actually says this twice. It says this in a different spot in the same story, like just a few verses later. And the Greek word basically brings out that he like snorted like a horse in anger and was troubled. It's a really strange word. And he said, where have you laid him? Come and see. And then Jesus wept. And so here's this wide range of emotions. And I kind of like to think that this indignance, this anger, could have been the same kind of anger that Jesus saw when the leper came and was like, can you heal me? Is Jesus is angry at God's creation, like being destroyed, being marred. I mean, think about if you had like a favorite place in nature, that you just like to go and hang out with your kids and get away. Maybe it's a park, and then they decide, you know what, we're going to get rid of this park. We're going to completely destroy it, and we're going to put like a can factory or something. I don't know. I don't know, a food plant over here, you'd be like, what the heck, man? You were just destroying God's good creation and something that people should be able to enjoy for like garbage, And so that, I think, would be the indignance. And then we see this consistency of character with Jesus throughout, right? And the heart, and towards the hardness of people's hearts as well. All right. So more lesser known characters, and I'm wrapping up here. So thank you guys so much for hanging in with me on this. I hope this is interesting. Mary and Martha, we see these consistent character portrayals. You might say, well, big deal. Jesus, so what? He's kind of the main guy, right? Like, of course they're going to get his character, right? They're talking about him all the time. They know what kind of, they think, they have an idea just through the oral tradition alone. They could kind of get a good idea of what his character was like. So what? Well, how about some lesser known characters like Mary and Martha? In Luke 8:40 or Luke 10:38-42, very famous passage. Jesus visits the home of Mary and Martha. Martha is super busy. She's bustling with preparations. She's full of worry. She's full of stress. She's full of anxiety. Her sister Mary is seated, attentively listening to Jesus. Martha becomes flustered and requests Jesus to ask Mary for help. Jesus, in response, defends Mary and emphasizes the significance of her choice to listen to him, right? And so, interestingly enough, we see Mary and Martha again in John's gospel. And it says that as soon as, this is again the story of the raising of Lazarus, Jesus gets there. Lazarus is their brother, okay? And as soon as Martha heard that she arrived, Martha went straight to him, but it says that Mary stayed seated at home. And so right away we notice a pretty casual, pretty subtle coincidence in the reactions, right? Mary's seated, and Martha is the one who's like active, who's the one who's kind of more on the busy side, right? And then in 11:32, after Martha's initial conversation with Jesus, she secretly informs her sister Mary that Jesus is there and that he's calling for her. Mary promptly goes to Jesus, and like in Luke, she falls at his feet. And so she's just kind of like more dramatic in her character, more like physically demonstrative and expressive. In John 11:39, when Jesus instructs them to remove the stone from Lazarus' tomb, who is it that's like, hey, Lord, to quote the King James, by now he stinketh, Martha's concerned about the odor, right? And she's like, I don't want to like offend everybody and gross all my guests here that are here mourning over Lazarus. He's going to stink. He's been in there for 4 days. Well, this is again mirrors Martha's very practical nature, right? And so like these little things, these subtle things, it would be weird that like John is just really craftily reading Luke's gospel. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to make these characters like exactly alike with these little subtle kind of casual things there, draw no attention to it. And then maybe other people will notice someday. It's possible again, but I think reportage is a better hypothesis. More on Mary and Martha, and we're almost done. John centers on the meal. This is when Mary anoints Jesus' feet, that very famous story. This story appears to be told in Mark and Matthew. The same story told, I should say, the one in John 12 and the one in Mark and Matthew. However, Mark and Matthew don't mention Mary and Martha in this context. They're not even mentioned. The name of the woman isn't even mentioned. In contrast, John only provides the name of the woman who anoints Jesus' feet, but he includes further details, including the mention of Martha. It's Martha who, again, is serving the meal, just as she does in Luke's account. Matthew and Mark indicate that this event took place at the home of someone named Simon the leper. In the Synoptic Gospels, which include Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they agree with John that the meal occurred in Bethany. This suggests that Martha could have been involved in serving the meal at Simon's house. And in both Mark and John, it is Mary, consistent with her character, who generously pours expensive ointment on Jesus and on his head in Mark 14:3 and on his feet in John 12:3. So again, she's just like very expressive, cling to Jesus, love Jesus, that kind of thing. that is like her concern, right? That's who she is. That's what she's all about. And we see this similarity in character throughout. Similar to the situation in Luke, where Jesus had to defend Mary to her busy sister, here in John and possibly in Mark, Jesus defends Mary's actions when Judas Iscariot and others criticize her for bringing the valuable perfume when it could have been sold to benefit the poor, just as Jesus explained and supported Mary's choice as the better one in Luke. In John, he relates her gift to his burial and points out that he won't always be with him. Okay. And so again, we see Jesus defending Mary over the critics. Okay. So these consistent and vivid personalities demonstrated in various stories across different gospels make the characters of Mary, Martha, and Jesus feel authentic and relatable, despite their limited, well, not in the case of Jesus, but them all interacting together, despite their limited appearances in the gospel memoirs. Okay. And so that is these unity of characters that we see throughout as evidence there. And so, all right, getting back to the whole mythical thing, right? If you're going to go up against the Gospels, Greco-Roman parallels or Old Testament parallels, parallels, it's just not going to do it, right? If I was going to play devil's advocate against the Gospels, what you're going to need to find is serious contradictions. I'm not talking about reconcilable contradictions, or I'm not even talking about contradictions that could be the kind where you would expect to see an eyewitness testimony that there's going to be a little bit of variation, or somebody could make a good faith mistake, or it could just be based on like a minor memory lapse, okay, of an unimportant detail. They need to be like, more serious contradictions. It just can't possibly be true. Okay, one or the other has to be false, and not only can it be false, but it just has to be better explained on the idea that people are just inventing stories and this is what we would expect. These are the kind of contradictions that we would expect on that hypothesis. You would also want to find significant factual errors in their narratives. Okay, so do they get geography wrong? Do they get history wrong? Do they get historical figures wrong? Do they get these kind of things wrong? These are the kind of things that we need to see if we're going to say that they're not close up to the facts, that they're not really there, that they're not really interested in truth, that they're more interested in crafting a narrative and crafting a story. These things would cast doubt on their presence during the events and their access to reliable sources. Okay, so if you're going to argue against the Gospels, again, Osiris, Mithras, Balder, Romulus, all of these different like legends, myths, different stories, and different things like that. It doesn't really do it. Okay, because again, my hypothesis predicts the same things that yours does. Okay, and so you need to find a different way to sync the Gospels. If you want to argue against the Gospels, then argue against the kind of evidence that I'm presenting here, and saying, no, actually myths and legends actually really do look like this. They do have undesigned coincidences. They do have external incidental confirmations, lots of them, dozens of them that are obscure, and they have these other kind of marks of realism. Then you got something. But as Lewis, who brought all of his literary experience to the fore, the man loved myths. He rewrote myths. I mean, what do you think Till We All Have Faces is? I think he saw these things. And so I'm hoping people dig in and see these things more as well. And so further breaking the symmetry, and then I'm done here. We also have to think, if God exists, his chosen divine figure would be successful. So maybe you don't like these textual evidences. Maybe you think they're whack. Maybe you think they're just kind of Maybe you think they're just weak evidence. Okay. But if God exists, his chosen divine figure would be successful, whereas others would not. God would also send a prophet to foretell such figures coming in a recognizable way. I think that's something that is a reasonable prediction, right? Well, in Isaiah 49:6-7, there's a prophecy about a figure who will be a light to the nations and will bring salvation to the ends of the earth, despite being despised, I'll get this right here, and abhorred by the nation. So he's rejected, despised, and abhorred by his own nation, but he actually ends up becoming the light for all the nations. Well, Jesus, as a Jew, claimed to be the Messiah and founded a worldwide religion that has since included billions of Gentiles, despite being rejected by his own nation, thus fulfilling the prophecy of being a global influence. Christianity's transformation from a persecuted minority to a dominant global religion was highly improbable given the historical context. It was vanishingly small. I mean, Christianity was almost grinded into the dust, right? However, various Old Testament passages, besides just Isaiah 49:6, predicted the Messiah would bring representatives of all nations to recognize and worship the God of Israel. And so you have this tiny, tiny nation have this oracle, and not just one oracle in Isaiah, but you actually see this idea of this Messiah figure bringing all nations to worship the God of Israel. You see it through the Psalms, you see it in Zechariah, you see it in many, many different places. And this is exactly what has happened, right? Jesus himself foretold that the gospel would be proclaimed worldwide, indicating the growth of his kingdom. Remember, he talks about the mustard seed kingdom. It starts off very small, becomes like one of the largest of all plants, right? And when considering whether an individual is the promised Messiah, the probability of them fulfilling this prophecy is nearly certain if they actually are God's chosen Messiah, whereas it is extremely unlikely if they are not. And we think about all the other people who claim to be the Jewish Messiah versus Jesus, like, you know, we're not worshiping Simon Bar Kokhba right now, or some of these other guys that have failed even, you know, in medieval times and different things like that. And so there are also strong differences that show the superiority of Christianity over these other faiths, such as Jesus' own self-claims and character, in the existence of well-attested miracles in Christian contexts. I already did an entire stream on what I think are very well-attested Christian miracle claims. Well, if Christianity is true, we would expect something like that. And well, what do you know? We do have many well-attested miracle claims in Christianity, whereas we don't really see that in other faiths. And I'm talking about, just go back and watch that particular stream because I go through some very stringent kind of criteria, medically speaking, that we would need to have. And then, of course, Jesus's character. I mean, think about Jesus's character compared to, say, the character of these other mythological figures. I would like for people to think like it's pretty different, you know, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, I am humble and lowly, take my yoke upon you, love your enemies, pray for those who abuse you, and all of these other different things. The characteristics of Jesus is something that I'm not saying it couldn't be made up, humanly speaking, but when people made up gods and when people made up legendary figures, they had, I mean, if you look at the Roman and Greco-Roman gods, they're jerks. They're terrible people. They're doing all kinds of horrible things, right? They're outdoing each other in terribleness, right? And so, again, doesn't mean that these characteristics can't be a human invention. But I'm just saying, like, you would expect if God is going to have this a divine figure who's like going to say, hey, follow me, he's going to be a moral exemplar. And that's what Jesus is. And he's changed the world. And if you can't see that, then you need to read a book. Okay. Read Tom Holland's Dominion, and so I won't elaborate on that anymore. And so finally, last slide. Thank you guys so much. Been going an hour and 15 minutes. I appreciate you hanging in there. Jesus, the myth made fact. This is Lewis again, with his very based thug life conclusion. Just as God is nonetheless God by being a man, so the myth remains myth even when it becomes fact. The story of Christ demands from us and repays not only a religious and historical, but an imaginative response. I just kind of talked about that superiority where people want to follow Jesus. Little kids want to come up to him, according to the story that I just said. People want to devote their lives to him, give their lives to him, be martyred for him because he inspires something in them, and that they'll pray for their enemies while they're being burned at the stake, and different things like that. He, puts an ethic in people that they want to be, chaste and pure and in their speech and in their actions and all of these different things, right? Anyways, it is directed to the child, the poet, and the savage in us, as well as the conscience and to the intellect. One of its functions is to break down dividing walls. And so there's a beauty and an attractiveness to Jesus. Again, it's not reading the Gospels isn't like reading a newspaper report, okay, or any other just kind of bland historical account. If Jesus is really who he says he is, what kind of report would you expect? What kind of evidence do you want? Okay. Like, you can't just say not good enough, not good enough, not good enough. Like, what would it look like if it was in time and space and history and written down? What would appeal to the most people? Well, you think about how much the Gospels have gone out throughout the centuries, and it has broken down dividing walls for sure. And so that is my sermon at the end there. And so thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate you hanging in there. And I hope this was helpful. I hope this was instructional. And so my goal is to just create more conversations, more constructive conversations. And so let me know what you think in the comments. If you guys do have some questions for live chat, just type Q dash. I'll give you a moment. Let me know if you have anything, and I'd be happy to ask. Spartan Theology does have a question. Thanks, Ethan. Do you have a video responding to Goodacre on editorial fatigue? I don't. I would like to in the future. I don't think editorial fatigue is a very good like counter explanation for things like undesigned coincidences at all. And so, but I don't have anything at the moment. I think that would be one that would be worthwhile. And so stay tuned for that. Let's see if we got any other comments. Lewis is probably still the best pop or mass appeal apologist. I think I would agree in a lot of different ways, because Lewis appeals more to just like the head. He also appeals like to the heart in a lot of different ways. And so he just, and he has a way with words, of course, you know. But yeah, I think there's kind of like there's that meme, you know, with the bell curve, and there's, you know, the Jedi lady, and then there's the dumb guy at the other side of the bell curve, and then there's the angry soy jack in the middle. And yeah, I think I posted that meme before where it's like both the doofus guy on one side of the bell curve and the Jedi genius lady on the other side of the bell curve are like, yeah, Lewis was a great apologist. And you have the people in the middle of the bell curve that are like, no, he's so stupid. His ideas are bad. You know, the moral argument wasn't so good. And his formulation of like the argument from reason wasn't very good. And, or, you know, the trilemma, I mean, come on, you know, he left off legend. Well, I think what I'm saying here about his take on modern biblical criticism tells you that he did actually very strongly consider the legendary option. He just thought it was stupid. And so, so yeah, it's, you know, I think he is underrated, and I think people should go back and read more of his stuff. Trivial coincidence. Thanks for the question real quick. Why didn't you announce this earlier? Only just saw this. It's because I'm terrible at announcing streams. Basically, I finished a slide deck, and then I think, yeah, today's a good day. And then I just jump into it head first. I will, as I get more experienced, announce these. I still am treating a lot of these as practice. So I figure like, whatever, I'll just jump in, and if these are bad, so what? I'm just trying to learn to be a better speaker. And so that's why I don't announce them. I'll start to announce them as I gain more confidence. Truly though, when it comes to live streams, way more people watch after the fact than during. So I find that it could help a little bit, but not really. And so I don't really care. Just looking up at some of these comments here. Q. How much did you dislike the Rings of Power? As much as you should have, I hope. Callum, yeah, actually, I'm going to be really honest. I got so soured from all the negative reviews that I refused. I refused. I didn't even want to hate watch. I read enough. I saw enough. I watched enough videos. And I was like, this is just going to stress me out because I love Lord of the Rings, right? You know, I've read the book several times. I watched the movies more times than you can count. I can tell you all the times that, you know, oh, that's a real Hobbit, and that's not or that's the actors, and that's the little people filling in, you know, all the little things like, oh, look, Aragorn breaks his toe here in real life and all that goofy stuff. But anyways, no, I'm just goofing around. But yeah, I got so sour that I refuse to do it. And I'm really, really angry right now that I think it's Netflix is doing Narnia. And the person who, if I correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, the person who's making the Barbie, who made the Barbie movie, is doing Narnia. Like, why? Like, what is going on? Like why is Hollywood systematically like trying to like destroy my childhood or what? So I don't get it. I wish they wouldn't do stupid stuff like this. Hollywood is just too far gone, too screwed up to do anything right, it seems like these days. I also hated the Hobbit movies. They weren't nearly as bad as some as they could have been, I guess, compared to Rings of Power from what I hear. But it was kind of like Hobbits of the Caribbean. So, anyways, you and Stephen Boyce should do a live stream of Loader. Yeah, Boyce is a super fan, and yeah, he gets really animated about it. I need to go through his latest video on gospel authorship and would the church have even received the gospels as anonymous? Go check out his channel, Explore Christianity. I'm really looking forward to watching that video later, but he's the man when it comes to gospel authorship. Well, it looks like that's it. I don't have any other questions. And so again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. And yeah, I hope this was helpful. Leave a comment below of your thoughts, and I'll see you in the next one.